A tale of fate and fortune in America's wealthiest enclave. The muted glow of multiple screens illuminated 19-year-old Ethan Armstrong's private gaming sanctuary. He absently stirred his third artisanal cherry lime soda with a crystal straw, his fingers mechanically pressing buttons on the latest PlayStation controller. The room around him was a testament to privilege. Limited edition gaming consoles lined custom-built shelves, while a 98-inch OLED TV dominated one wall of his Greenwich Mansion suite. "Master Ethan," came Mrs. Parker's gentle voice from the doorway, "wouldn't you like to join your father for dinner tonight?" Ethan glanced at his watch. It was 7:30 p.m., and he had been gaming for 6 hours straight. "Thanks, Mrs. P, but I'm not hungry," he mumbled, not taking his eyes off the screen. The elderly housekeeper lingered, her concerned gaze settling on the untouched sandwich from lunch. She had been with the Armstrong family since Ethan was 5, since that terrible year when cancer took Mrs. Armstrong. The boy had never fully recovered from losing his mother so young. "Your mother would want you to eat properly," she said softly, knowing it was perhaps unfair to invoke Catherine Armstrong's memory, but still worried about the young man who seemed increasingly lost in his virtual worlds. Ethan's fingers stilled on the controller. "I miss her, Mrs. P, every single day." "I know, dear. We all do." Pausing his game, Ethan turned to face the woman who had been more of a mother than a housekeeper over the years. "Do you think she'd be disappointed in me? Just sitting here, playing games all day?" Mrs. Parker smiled kindly. "I think she'd understand that you're still finding your way, but she'd also want you to live, truly live, not just exist in this room." Ethan scoffed. "But look at Dad now, married to Victoria. That's not love. That's a business transaction with benefits." Mrs. Parker tensed slightly at the mention of the new Mrs. Armstrong, but kept her expression neutral. "Everyone processes grief differently. Your father was alone for a long time." The distant sound of Victoria's sharp voice carried up the stairs, making them both wince. Mrs. Parker straightened, smoothing her apron with practiced dignity. "I'll bring you up some dinner later, something you can eat while gaming." "Thanks, Mrs. P. You're the only one who really gets me." As the housekeeper left, Ethan sank deeper into his chair, cranking up the volume on his game to drown out his stepmother's voice. He had everything money could buy in this room, his own private sanctuary, but what he really wanted, love, understanding, connection, seemed impossibly out of reach. So he did what he always did, escaped into virtual worlds where he could be a hero, where he could save the day, where he could be more than just the poor little rich boy who lost his mother too soon. Richard Armstrong stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, his imposing reflection staring back at him. At 59, he cut an intimidating figure, bald head, broad shoulders that filled out his bespoke suit, and a distinctive scar running down his right cheek. Most people assumed it was from some dramatic business confrontation. If they only knew, it was from a neighbor's German shepherd when he was 10. "Mr. Armstrong," his assistant's voice cracked through the intercom. "The factory numbers are in." "Send them through, Janet," he replied, turning to face the mahogany desk that had seen him through 2 decades of business dealings. As he reviewed the latest figures from his furniture empire, his mind drifted to the early days. He had started with a single truck, buying discount furniture from closing stores and reselling it for a modest profit. Now Armstrong Furniture Manufacturing was one of the largest high-end furniture makers in New England. "You've come a long way, Rich," he muttered to himself, fingers unconsciously tracing the scar on his cheek. The photo on his desk caught his eye. Catherine, radiant in her garden, just months before the diagnosis. The cancer had been swift and merciless. He had spent every penny they had on treatments, but nothing could save her. "Dad!" Ethan's voice pulled him from his memories. Richard looked up at his son, seeing Catherine's eyes looking back at him. "The contractor needs your signature on these." "Come in, son. Sit with me a minute." Ethan hesitated but took a seat. These moments with his father had become rare since Victoria entered their lives. "I've been thinking about your mother lately," Richard said softly. "About how Mrs. Parker helped us through that time." "She's family, Dad. More than some people," Ethan replied, the edge in his voice unmistakable. Richard caught the tone but chose to ignore it. We've built something incredible here, Ethan. Something your mother would be proud of. From nothing to this." He gestured at the office, the factory visible through the windows beyond. "Yeah, well, Mom would have been proud no matter what," Ethan replied. "She wasn't impressed by money." Richard felt the familiar pang of guilt. Had he focused too much on building his empire after Catherine's death? Had he tried to fill the void with success instead of being there for his son? "Your mother understood sacrifice," he said finally. "Everything I've done for our family." "Including marrying Victoria?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard straightened in his chair, his business persona sliding back into place. "The contract, son." Ethan placed the papers on the desk and left without another word. Richard watched him go, then turned back to the window, his empire spread out before him. He had built all this from nothing. He had survived betrayals, knife wounds, heartbreak. But somehow, bridging the gap with his own son seemed like his most impossible challenge yet. Victoria Blackwood Armstrong's Louboutin heels clicked against the marble floors of the mansion like a metronome counting down to disaster. Her perfectly manicured fingers trailed along the antique sideboard as she approached Mrs. Parker, who was dusting the family photos. The morning light caught Victoria's massive diamond wedding ring, sending prisms dancing across the walls of the grand foyer. "Mrs. Parker," Victoria's voice dripped with honey-coated venom, "I believe we need to discuss your position here." The elderly housekeeper's hand stilled on the silver frame, holding a photo of young Ethan and his mother. "Yes, Mrs. Armstrong?" "The thing is," Victoria adjusted her Cartier bracelet, her emerald green eyes narrowing. "Ethan is grown now. The need for a nanny is long past." Her perfectly painted lips curved into a cruel smile. "I'll have your final paycheck prepared." Mrs. Parker's voice trembled slightly. "I've been with this family for 14 years. Since Catherine, and we're very grateful," Victoria cut her off, examining her fresh French manicure. "But times change. I'm lady of the house now, and I prefer to run things my way." From the doorway, Ethan watched the scene unfold, his fists clenched. 2 years of this woman in their home, and she was systematically destroying everything his mother had built. The warmth, the love, all of it replaced by Victoria's cold perfection. He remembered the day his father brought her home from that charity gala. She had played her part perfectly, charming, sophisticated, the perfect society wife. Even their honeymoon photos from Hawaii showed a couple seemingly in love. But Ethan had seen through her act from the start.